On November 24, 1971, a quiet man in a business suit boarded a commercial airplane in Portland, Oregon. He wasn't loud, he wasn't nervous, he simply bought a one-way ticket under the name Dan Cooper. What happened over the next few hours would become one of the most famous unsolved crimes in American history. The man calmly hijacked the plane. He demanded $200,000 in cash. Then, somewhere in the dark skies over the Pacific Northwest, he jumped out of the aircraft with a parachute and was never seen again. No body was ever found. No confirmed identity was discovered. No clear evidence ever revealed what happened after the jump. More than 50 years later, the mystery of D.B. Cooper still fascinates investigators, journalists, and conspiracy hunters around the world, because the truth is that no one knows who he really was. It was the afternoon before Thanksgiving in 1971. Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305 was scheduled to fly from Portland to Seattle, a short flight of about 30 minutes. Passengers boarded the Boeing 727 like any normal day. Among them was a man in his mid-40s. He wore a dark business suit, a white shirt, a thin black tie, and sunglasses. He carried a briefcase. Nothing about him seemed unusual. He purchased his ticket in cash for $20 and sat in seat 18C. The name on the ticket was Dan Cooper. After the plane took off, the man ordered a drink, bourbon and soda, and quietly smoked a cigarette. At that time, smoking was still allowed on airplanes. Everything seemed perfectly normal until he called over the flight attendant. The flight attendant was Florence Schaffner. When she approached his seat, the man handed her a small folded note. At first, she assumed it was simply a phone number. That occasionally happened on flights, and she slipped it into her purse without reading it. The man leaned closer and calmly said, "Miss, you'd better look at that note. I have a bomb." She opened the note and read the message. It was short and direct. He claimed he had a bomb in his briefcase and demanded $200,000 in cash, along with 4 parachutes. He instructed the crew not to alert passengers and to follow his instructions carefully. To prove he was serious, he opened the briefcase slightly. Inside, the attendant saw wires and red cylindrical objects that looked like explosives. At that moment, it became clear that the plane had been hijacked. What made the situation even more unusual was how calm the man remained. He wasn't shouting or threatening people aggressively. Instead, he behaved almost politely. Witnesses later said he seemed organized, patient, and strangely professional. He dictated the demands clearly and carefully. The plane continued toward Seattle while the airline contacted authorities. The FBI and local police began assembling the ransom money as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, the passengers had no idea what was happening. They were simply told that the plane's arrival would be delayed due to a minor technical issue. Inside the cabin, the man sat quietly, drinking his bourbon and smoking another cigarette, waiting. When the plane landed in Seattle, the FBI delivered the ransom. The money totaled $200,000 and was packed into a bag. Along with it were the 4 parachutes he had requested. The plane remained on the runway while negotiations continued. Finally, the hijacker allowed all 36 passengers to leave the aircraft safely. Only the flight crew remained on board. At this point, many people expected the situation to end, but Cooper had something else in mind. The hijacker ordered the crew to refuel the plane and take off again. His destination was Mexico City, but he gave very specific flight instructions. He demanded the aircraft fly at 10,000 feet, keep the landing gear partially down, fly at a slower speed than usual, and keep the rear stairway accessible. This detail would later become extremely important. The Boeing 727 had a unique feature that very few aircraft had: a set of stairs that lowered from the rear of the plane. Cooper clearly knew about this design, and it soon became clear that he planned to use those stairs. Around 7:40 in the evening, the plane took off again. This time, there were only 4 crew members and the hijacker on board. Outside, the sky was dark and thick clouds covered much of Washington state. The aircraft flew south through the night. At some point during the flight, Cooper instructed the crew to remain inside the cockpit and not come back to the cabin. He moved toward the rear of the plane carrying the parachutes and the bag filled with ransom money. Then something strange happened. Around 8:13 p.m., the cockpit crew felt a sudden upward movement in the aircraft, almost like a shift in weight. Investigators later believed that this was the exact moment when D.B. Cooper lowered the rear stairs and jumped into the cold darkness below. Then, nearly 9 years later, something strange happened that reopened the mystery. In 1980, a young boy named Brian Ingram was playing along the Columbia River while on vacation with his family. As he dug into the sand near the water, he uncovered several bundles of old cash. The bills were damaged and partially decayed, but when investigators examined them, they made a shocking discovery. The serial numbers on the money matched the ransom bills from the D.B. Cooper hijacking. Almost $6,000 of the stolen money had been buried in the sand along the river. But the discovery raised even more questions than answers, because no one could explain how the money ended up there. More than 50 years later, the mystery still remains unsolved. Did Cooper survive the jump? Some experts believe it would have been nearly impossible. The weather that night was cold and stormy. The terrain below was dense forest and rugged mountains. Cooper jumped wearing only a business suit and loafers. But other investigators argue something very different. They point out that Cooper appeared to know a surprising amount about aircraft and flight operations. He chose the exact type of plane that allowed a rear exit. He requested multiple parachutes. He carefully controlled the altitude and speed of the aircraft before the jump. To some experts, it seemed like he knew exactly what he was doing. Despite decades of investigation, the FBI officially closed the case in 2016. The identity of D.B. Cooper remains unknown to this day. No confirmed suspect was ever identified, and no clear explanation was ever discovered. But the story became a legend. Books, documentaries, films, and endless theories continue to explore what might have happened that night. Was he a skilled criminal who escaped with the money and started a new life somewhere else? Or was he a desperate man whose body still lies somewhere deep in the forests of Washington state? What makes the story of D.B. Cooper so fascinating isn't just the crime itself, it's the mystery that surrounds it. In a world filled with surveillance cameras, digital records, and advanced forensic technology, a man once hijacked a plane, jumped into the darkness, and simply disappeared. And more than half a century later, we are still asking the same question. Who was D.B. Cooper?